David, we've pushed our start back just 1 hour today, but we are ready to begin. Once again, we continue to explore this as yet. I mean, I don't know, has the Canadian press or the Canadian government addressed this mass grave of 215 dead children? And also, how are you today, David?
I'm very well, and it's good to be with you, Jason. Yeah, they've got the platitudes trotted out, right? And how this is an appalling abuse of First Nations or Aboriginal or Indigenous people. Oh, wait a minute.
But they don't do anything, do they?
Yeah. Now, why am I getting a double?
Double what?
What have I got? Hang on. Let me just.
Well, let me just remind our viewers, David, that in an hour from now, we're going to be starting our sponsor-exclusive segment on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI or patreon.com/reverse-CSI. People can also watch on subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. And in honor of Canada, actually that's not true, but in honor of YouTube being a bunch of jerks, we are now also available live streaming on Canadian social media video platform Rumble. So people can go to rumble.com/user/CSTheTruth, and they can watch our live streams on Rumble, David. So that's pretty cool. We're live there right now.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary technology, and thanks for accommodating me with the time shift. But anyway, so back to is the Canadian government seriously involved in investigating, for example, the 215 remains of children from the Kamloops Indian residential school? And the answer is no. They're going through the motions of blaming the colonial past, right, which is partially legitimate, but it begs the question how those children died. I want to see a proper autopsy done, because I think we'll find those children died through a range of things, from malnutrition, they were starved to death, or disease, or they were murdered through sexual or physical abuse. And it's very important to understand which of those reasons they might have died, because there's no statute of limitations on murder. And I see that word horror, and no doubt there'll be words like tragedy. But I think now that we're getting very close to the possibility, and it's so horrific that maybe that would fit J. Edgar Hoover's comment about the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous they can't believe it exists. I believe those children and children in residential schools across the country and into the United States were actually used for biotesting or biowarfare tests with gain of function viruses vaccinated or injected into their system to find out what might be useful for population control of the kind that the Nazis in World War II evidently were involved in. And I've just maybe this is a bit spooky, but perhaps Dr. Fauci might come after me. Well, that would be flattering. But I do think Dr. Mengele, the famous doctor in Auschwitz, experimented with identical twins with the most brutal, callous manner, etc., etc. But did you know, or I think you did know, that the children in those residential schools were subjected to medical experiments, in particular,
well, absolutely,
with their nutrition.
Right.
Yes. So now,
well, sorry, David, let me just interject a bit there, because I think you're opening up some really interesting topics. And of course, for people who missed us last week, they can still go back and see those videos on Subscribestar or Patreon or Rumble. I think the YouTube channel, I mean, it's a little difficult now for people to find us on YouTube, David, because YouTube keeps crushing our channels. I want to make sure our viewers know that I've created a YouTube channel specifically for the appearances on Crowdsource the Truth. That is, David's appearances on Crowdsource the Truth and our legacy videos. This is another spot where people can catch our weekly live streams. But if you search YouTube for David Hawkins Reverse CSI, you can watch us on here right now. And I agree, David, you know, the fact that they haven't given us any kind of explanation for these 215 bodies in the graves, it seems like they're avoiding investigating it. And it's strange because when I search for news about this, really most of the news is now kind of becoming old. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. It's interesting to me that there's a story from just 2 days ago from the Washington Post. May I ask you, David, before we get back to the Joseph Mengele and Nazi aspect of this, which I agree, there's a lot of reasons to wonder if that sort of thing is going on. And certainly if they're not investigating this and giving us some sort of scientific conclusion, we similarly have a right, just as if they had destroyed the evidence, to presume guilt. What do you think about this photograph right here, David, in the Washington Post with this very prominent reflection?
That's almost like a parallel narrative, isn't it? An echo, a visual simile for what's going on in the real world is what's going on. It's a bit like Plato's cave. But now that's a very interesting, that's the 9/11 memorial in New York City.
It's also a reflecting pool, isn't it?
Yes. And it was built by Bovis, right?
So what do we think about the reflection? Does it have some meaning?
Well, I mean, you might say this is a parallel universe, right? So the reflections are the ones, you know, Plato's cave where the prisoner is chained and has his back to the opening of the cave, and up on the wall, you have the shadows, the two-dimensional shadows of the outside world. And if that's the only reality, the human brain being what it is, that's the reality. It's a two-dimensional world, right? If people follow my object-oriented paintbrush, they'll know it's a 12-dimensional world. But again, I don't want to stray into the technology. What they're doing through the media is creating an impression of what they want us to believe, while the reality is actually being communicated through an inner circle of people who are part of the conspiracy. So now, just before the show started, you dug up an image of the General Post Office at St. Martin's le Field, and that was the place called the Instrument Room, where all of the overseas telegraph cables would bring in their signals, and they would be dispatched by telegraph boys to different parts of the country or different parts of the city, in particular the wealthy people that communicated extensively via the telegraph, particularly if you want to make a buy or sell order on the London Stock Exchange. And there's a fascinating name here that I think gives substance to the thesis that you and I are essentially developing. The instrument room of the General Post Office, which was a vast building when the empire was at its height, was known as the Imperial Brain for obvious reasons. If you sit there, you get advance warning of the price of wool in Australia, or the gold discovery or the diamonds discovery in South Africa, and you are in a position to parcel out that information that gives certain people prior knowledge of what's going to happen on the stock market, and they get incredibly rich. And that continues to this day, except that post office building has been pulled down. But there is, I believe, an imperial brain, right? And the imperial brain is the network of BBC studios around the world, of which there are 29. There are 7 in the United Kingdom. There's 1 in New York. I believe there's 4 in China. And those studios, I believe, have been connected through fiber optic links. And we discussed that quite extensively last show. But with fiber optic links, it's far more difficult, a lot more difficult, is to hack into a fiber optic link than it is to satellite signals or mobile radio signals. So
but
this
David,
is really
let me just
interesting.
keep you for a moment on the earlier thought you raised about likening Dr. Fauci to Joseph Mengele. But before we get to Fauci, I think we need to consider that point of view with regard to everything that we're learning about these indigenous schools. Now, last week, you showed me an article about an adult guy who's actually getting on in his years, who was a child in one of these schools, who described a medical procedure by which he was given a pretty substantial incision into which some sort of treated gauze was put in there, that he described how it became putrid, and there was something going on with doctors looking at it and doing things to it, but he was never told what it was, has no idea if that was an inoculation or a test. And it reminded me, David, very much of this book that I've recently read, the Operation Paperclip. This is exactly what the Nazis were doing to Jewish prisoners and Polish prisoners, and they had gypsies and all kinds of people that the Nazis considered. They had like the Undermensch and the Übermensch. They considered themselves intellectually and physically superior, and that they had a group of expendable people who they could conduct medical experiments on, ostensibly for their own benefit and to help the Reich. How does that differ from what Canada was doing in these indigenous schools? And could this be a practice derived from Fabian socialist ideas brought to the United States and North America by, somebody like Pierre Elliott Trudeau and this sort of deal with the devil, Chinese communists that Bill Clinton enabled through his presidency, and now even his dopey son, Justin Trudeau, is the word sycophantic in this photograph?
Well, sick, certainly, but I think I pronounce it sycophantic, but we're a Brit, so we don't know, right? It's all right.
Color.
You may be right. Yeah. So let's just zoom out on that image, because I think now this is a classic example of what you and I have discussed extensively about artificial intelligence and the IJCAI conference of '81 at the UBC, where I was as a delegate from Schlumberger, because I was coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research at Schlumberger in Richfield. And there was a paper there. I didn't hear that particular presentation, but there was a paper here that is totally germane to the issue we're looking at now, tracking characters and understanding narratives. So now what we've fallen into the trap, when I say we, I think the general public, we track characters like Bill Clinton, the charismatic Slick Willie stuff, but we don't follow the narrative in which he is embedded. And it's far more useful to understand Bill Clinton to track the narrative of his life, which includes being expelled from Oxford University for rape and dealing in drugs in 1968, right? And his preferred method of rape, and there are 6 credible accusations of rape against this guy, is that he would bite through the lower lip of his victim and then, I don't know, throw him a handkerchief, if they were lucky, to mop up the blood. I mean, this guy is, anyway, words almost fail me. But anyway, he crept through the net. And then in 1969, I believe he goes to Moscow to chat up the KGB and probably tell them how to, interrogate John McCain at the Hanoi Hilton. He comes back to the States. He gets a law degree at Yale. And then he becomes on faculty, I think in 1974, at Arkansas University School of Law. I think he was talking or teaching constitutional law, and Hillary taught criminal law, but I'm not too sure on that. But the point is, at that time, the Arkansas University medical physicians had been collecting blood from the prison system in Arkansas for use in presumably experiments on, producing a plasma that might be universally available. But what they appear to have done is they concentrated the blood supplies and they shipped it up to Canada through a broker in Montreal to Connaught Laboratories at the University of Toronto that was privatized by Pierre Trudeau in 1973. And what they created, and I shared with you on Thursday evening chat, that possibly gain of function research, which has a very specific term in the development of pathogens, may have a parallel in general business called value added. That is to say, if your agenda was population control or eugenics, which is one of the 3 legs of the tripod practiced by the Fabians, then you could say, if you find a pathogen that can eliminate a certain target community or terrify a certain target community, this would be very attractive to Fabians who seek, through their three-legged platform, if you will, population control, centralized credit, and government by a bureaucratic elite. So fast forward Isn't that where America finds itself today? Don't you have centralized credit? Who is lending money to the American government to get the economy through this period, which in the normal course of events would... Exactly, exactly. So with your title or our title, we talk about a sinister alliance, right? Using the residential schools for testing bioweapons. So these poor children, and I don't know which particular residential school that came from, but you have precise parallels in the United States. I believe there's a very strong probability, and it's a terrifying probability, that they became guinea pigs for biological warfare pathogens testing. And in the particular case of Kamloops Indian Residential School, they were experimenting with the nutrition of the children. So here's my hypothesis. I believe what they were doing as a follow-up to the Nazis during World War II, they were trying to find a place where it would be relatively safe to conceal a biowarfare experiment where the children might be, if they weren't killed, turned into asymptomatic carriers of a disease. So after they'd gone through the school, they would come out at the other end angry and radicalized because they'd been taken from their parents. They would be alienated because they weren't allowed to speak their native language or First Nations language. So when they went home back to the community where they were born and raised, they no longer, how shall I put it, acknowledged the authority, if that's the right word, of their parents. They were alienated from their parents. And now you have the seeds of social control, because if you can alienate families, like this extraordinary outfit called Maximus in the around the world, actually, where they're administering a program called the Family Maintenance Enforcement Program in BC, and the equivalent in the United States, which has this dreadful name, Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act. So essentially, Maximus and its shareholders, and we'll come to that in a minute, they're all about alienating families, breaking the family up as a unit within a society, and basically radicalizing and pointing the children at the parents. Because if those children, for example, have been vaccinated so that they actually are now carriers of a virus that could kill a senior, or maybe the children, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, are being deployed to the countries they came from, which might be China and Wuhan City, right? And they're actually infecting the population there without knowing that that's what they're doing. Over to you.
I wanted to bring to your attention, David, this article here that I just found. Are you aware of this?
No, I've just seen it the first time.
It's quite interesting. So this is an article, sorry, hang on one second here. This is an article that's talking about a lawsuit that seems to have begun in 2019. And it's saying, I guess, Inuit are members of a indigenous tribe, perhaps?
Correct.
5 Inuit have filed a lawsuit against the federal government over medical experiments, including skin grafts. Now, this is exactly the type of experimentation that a Polish woman spoke about at the Nazi doctor trials, where some of these, Nazi experiments were there. She showed up and spoke about how they gave her these debilitating skin grafts. And they talk about specific universities, the names of individuals who are involved. McGill University is named, which I have heard elsewhere as being involved in MK Ultra. The lawyer, the Edmonton lawyer, Stephen Cooper, said his research shows experiments were done under the International Biological Program, a multinational scientific effort between 1964 and 1974. Archives from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, I guess they don't know about the television part of it. They say the program eventually had 9 areas of study, including human adaptability to environmental physiology. Who the hell knows what that means? But the University of Alberta, University of Manitoba, and McGill University were all involved. Plus, obviously, the United States was involved with the National Academy of Sciences. And I mean, David, this just sounds to me like an Operation Paperclip thing.
Yeah, just hold on. Just go down. Just hold it there. I'm reading this. Canada intentionally instilled in Nunavummiut, sorry if the pronunciation is bad, the perception that they must do without question as they were told by Canada. What does that remind you of?
Listen and obey.
Outside the BBC, right?
Yes.
So the Sinister alliance is the BBC, right? Outside the BBC, there are the carvings by Eric Gill, who was actually a pedophile who raped his own daughters and the family dog, right? He was a very sick, but perhaps an extraordinary artist, depending on your point of view. But if you look at those carvings, essentially, we're getting the theme of listen and obey that is propagated through young people. It's almost Mengelian, except that that statue or that carving was put up in 1934 before the Nazis had taken over in Germany and built the concentration camps, and Mengele started making his experiments. That is to say, my assertion is the BBC is the Sinister alliance that connects through, and you and I have discussed that in order to overthrow the government of the United States, any power or any force is going to need to synchronize or coordinate three intelligence networks: human intelligence networks, signals intelligence network, and financial intelligence network. And what I can prove now is with the BBC Studios network, you know, the 29 studios around connected by fiber optics, it has a real-time possibility of generating one parallel narrative for the consumption of we the people, and another parallel narrative that drives the agents into a crime scene before the crime occurs to take evidence away from the crime and bear false witness and cover up the crime itself. Over to you.
You know, David, it's interesting. The parallel narrative concept is so powerful. It covers the concept of double agents, the double cross. You know, there's one narrative that a particular person is a German agent, but then another narrative that they're working for the British. And you've spoken about this extensively with that J.C. Masterman book. But I think we need to take this back even further than World War II, David, because if we look at the American Revolutionary War in 1776, where the United States won independence from the British Crown, you've often spoken about how Cecil Rhodes and other like-minded, British elites felt that, they were pissed off that the United States took all this stuff and a bunch of rogues had broken away from the crown. Cecil Rhodes even spoke about a 200-year plan. You've told me about this. I didn't know about it at all. His 200-year plan to recapture the colonies using Dominion citizens. Wouldn't, David, the British Empire and all its great experience and knowledge have anticipated the possibility of a colonial victory in the Revolutionary War and put double agents in there among the colonists to activate this 200-year plan at some point in the future?
Absolutely. And it may have been that the Boston Tea Party was staged by the British East India Company and its cohorts in London, because three of the ships on which the tea was that came into Boston Harbor were British East India Company ships. And just to give people a quick history lesson, the British East India Company was founded, I believe, in the last year of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, and it would go on to become the world's most powerful corporation ever. It would have 250,000 men under arms, faster ships than the British Royal Navy, probably better armed, and it created the billionaires of the day. Queen Victoria tried to control it by shutting it down, but the people working with the British East India Company then were absorbed into the British Army. And just a quick historical reference, the first reference that I've been able to find about bioweapons by the British Army is a reference to the purchase of some smallpox-laden blankets from a smallpox hospital in order to infect the First Nations that were giving some trouble to the British, and that was 1763. So what I'm saying is there is a regular history, right? Or certainly speech. People don't know how successful or unsuccessful that was. But as you go through World War II, let's not pretend that the British weren't very active in terms of bioweapons research. So Churchill was concerned that the Germans might drop anthrax or whatever on British agricultural properties. And so he instructed Porton Down, I believe, to manufacture 5 million anthrax-laced cattle cakes that could be dropped over the agricultural territory in Germany, basically kill the cattle and starve the Germans out. It never happened that way. But what I'm saying, there was a very active program in biological weapons research. And one of the principal there was Victor Rothschild, right? Who is a world-renowned, well, he was a very famous zoologist and biologist, and he had total acquaintance, probably the lead director of the Porton Down research establishment, and he was the right-hand man of Churchill for these kinds of technologies. Yeah, so back to the collage, I think this is a very, very fruitful line of inquiry. Like, were the residential schools and the children within them and equivalent organizations like prisons or immigration centers, did they serve the British Empire, or at least elements within the British Empire, to test and develop or trial various pathogens and the vaccines that could then be turned around and take out or cull target populations? So, for example, after the level 4 lab came online in Winnipeg at the National Microbiology Lab, that was 1998, it would appear they developed gain of function research that generated H1N1 that primarily targeted children, right? And then COVID-19. So we have a wealth of circumstantial evidence that it may not have been a Wuhan virus. It's more likely a Winnipeg virus. And if my theory is correct, maybe it's a Kamloops virus. That is to say, the original virus that they started playing with was a virus developed and then tried out in the Kamloops Indian residential school and their partners in North America. And when they found out the right combination of nutrition, vaccine, and virus that would take some of those children that by then had been alienated from their families, they could actually become asymptomatic carriers and go into communities and maybe kill the parents or the grandparents. Over to you.
Well, David, what is going on? Every time I talk, this stupid thing needs to be reset. This is not the same clicking problem that I was experiencing previously, but rather a totally different problem. So, David, just like that other stuff, when we go to look at news about Dr. Chu and the biosafety level 4 lab in Winnipeg, we're not, the Canadian authorities have not exactly been forthcoming. New calls for a probe, U.S. lawmakers. We haven't heard anything about this Canadian lab in the mainstream news here in the United States. And the last bit of news that we heard coming out of Canada was that they were asking public health authorities to say something about where the hell this scientist is, and they're not.
Right. Well, let's just go back to the idea that if the American dominions or colonies are going to be recovered, that needs to have an international organization that can synchronize signals intelligence, human intelligence, and financial intelligence, and target the United States, and basically get Americans. And what was it, William Casey, the former CIA director, he said, we will know when our disinformation program is complete when everything Americans believe is false. I think he declared that at a sort of 1981 period. So I think that's what, and remember, it's elements within the British Empire. The average Brit, I can assure you, is a loyal friend of the United States, and vice versa. Equally true of Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. But the technique of disinformation that has been pioneered and perfected by the BBC and manifested now through BBC studios is so subtle that I think you have good, smart, intelligent people in your circle of acquaintances, and they look at you as though you crawled out from under a rock, that you're nuts. But you see, there's a historical parallel here that stretches back to, let's say, 1763, when the idea of selling smallpox-laden blankets to First Nations that was floated, right? Then through World War II. So the experiments by Mengele in the concentration camps developed a great deal of expertise amongst people who would then be imported or introduced into the United States through Operation Paperclip. And just to remind people about that, Operation Paperclip was basically set up by British intelligence to take Nazis or concentration camps or medical professionals or whatever and bleach their past so no one would know the terrible deeds that they'd done, and then give them a passport or a visa to enter the United States, where a significant number ended up working for the CIA.
Well, and NASA and the medical establishment, and they were placed in various universities. If people read the book, there was quite a lot of controversy among the intellectuals, while this was going on. But it strikes me, David, that this is kind of similar to what Bill Clinton did. So I didn't know that the British were behind it. I mean, the book comes at it from the standpoint of the CIA and Allen Dulles and the United States' role in the whole thing. But let's talk about that in a moment. The similarity that I see is, this is a picture of Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi scientist who became like the director of NASA or something and was critical in the U.S. space program. We've heard these allegations that through Charlie Tree and Chinagate, Bill Clinton released all kinds of ballistic missile technology and secrets to the Chinese. You've told us about this idiotic speech that, what's his name? Not Crick Falusi, what's his name?
Oh, Shalikashvili.
Shalikashvili,
yeah.
That he gave all the technology to the Chinese. So it's kind of similar, right? We've got someone who's presented as an enemy, but in the parallel narrative, we're giving them all this technology that advanced their culture. I mean, the Chinese yesterday just launched their first manned mission to a new Chinese space station, just as the International Space Station controlled by the United States and Russia is about to be decommissioned.
Right. Now, this is very important because I believe those people, including Bill Clinton and Pierre Trudeau, they have moved into a situation where they've proved themselves vulnerable to pedophile entrapment and blackmail. So, and this is the heart of the human intelligence network, which is incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous and extraordinarily effective in teasing secrets or information out of people who would not otherwise want to give it. So I want to now relate this back to Justin Trudeau and his activities when he arrived in British Columbia in 1996, and he became a ski bum or a ski instructor or whatever. But of course, he's the son of the former prime minister. And a number of things happened in 96 that Americans need to pay attention up here in BC. First of all, the Piggy Palace Good Times Society was registered to hold sports and entertainment events out at the Picton Pig Farm, which proved to be the scene, allegedly, where 100 women were tortured and killed, in some cases in front of an audience of 1,700 people. Secondly, the StarNet communications operation was started. This was raided on the 20th of August of 1999 by 150 law enforcement officers, including FBI. But StarNet Communications was charged.
And RCMP.
Yes,
Bob
and
Paulson.
RCMP and IRS and US Customs, high-tech squad from Ottawa. They took away all of the evidence on 3 floors on what the officer in command of the raid said. It looked like Star Wars in there. This was a high-tech organization that was producing and distributing hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming into 60 countries. So Vancouver and British Columbia became the hub of pedophile tracking and trafficking. And then there's one more vitally important element that is existing today.
Have you ever noticed this before, this circle?
Yeah, I think we did take a look at it, but I don't know what it is.
I haven't noticed that before.
Okay, but now we come to child base. Now, child base is basically, I believe, what binds together the Sinister alliance. Now, Childbase received a cyber award from an outfit called PolCyb, right? Policing cyberspace. Remember Dr. Ortis's thesis in 2006 was about
Bowing
compromised
to
nodes,
Quirinus.
bowing to Quirinus, which is the authority figure, right? And I think that authority figure is the BBC carving outside Broadcasting House, which says listen and obey. Bowing to Quirinus, compromised nodes, and cybersecurity in East Asia. I can't think of a more dangerous and effective way of compromising a node is to invite people to stay overnight at a motel near a residential school and have a child delivered to their motel room or their hotel room to do what they wanted, and to provide a disposal service of the remains of the child in an unmarked grave up at the Kamloops Indian residential school, and their equivalent across North America. So how many people who were high flyers with the potential capacity of becoming a president, a prime minister, an attorney general, or a state governor, right? How many people would get trapped into that kind of situation? Hormones are raging. There's a ready available school of children or a community of children that can be used to entrap these people. And some of those children may have been infected intentionally, right, with to become asymptomatic carriers. So they infect these people at the top. Now,
Well, I mean, without going all the way down that line, David, certainly they seem to be infected with something. That person who reported his own experience of having a gauze thing inserted into a cut that began to stink. Just to go back to this, I'm told here by Tony that this is a medicine wheel. And I don't really know what a medicine wheel is. Susan says it's a good thing. Heart, yellow, red, earth, black body, white, mind. So, I mean, there's a lot of Native American symbology around here. I also take note that we have these two holes that are really reminiscent of the World Trade Center memorial thing. And remember, David, people who've been watching us for years will recall that when I came to visit you in Vancouver, a local resident, without even a moment's hesitation, told us that this mural was a warning. And there's a lot of other artwork around here down in the alley, and just pictures of Native children being kind of taken from their parents, and some really rather here we go, some really meaningful art that have a lot of these same symbols that we've seen, reminiscent of what's tattooed onto Justin Trudeau's arm. This is fascinating stuff to me.
Yeah, well, I believe we've got an extraordinary thread here. So just coming back to Childbase. Childbase was given this award by PolCyb, Policing Cyberspace, one of whose directors is Hong En Ko, who's a director of Huawei, which had stolen a lot of the technology from Nortel and I believe its fiber optic links, right? And so the three partners of Childbase are Serco in the United Kingdom, the National Crime Squad in the United Kingdom, and Images Technologies of Vancouver, which uses artificial intelligence for face recognition. Now, Serco has got a major contract for contact tracing in the United Kingdom. Its equivalent in North America, Maximus, is the biggest supplier of vaccine supply chain management services and contact tracing. Both of those companies are controlled by this three fund cartel, right? And we haven't talked much about it, but I think it's very important to bring this into the equation, because the three fund cartel that includes State Street, established in 1792, Vanguard, established in 1975, and BlackRock in 1988, they are reckoned to be in control of every corporate entity on the New York stock market by 2028. That is to say, these companies are not independent companies. They control, for example, HBO Max. I'm sure they control Netflix and YouTube. So when they want to shut down inquiry, what I call reverse crime scene investigation, they have the power to call up a CEO, chief executive officer of a target organization and say, pull the plug on Donald Trump, right? Or pull the plug of the Twitter feed or the YouTube account on Jason Goodman. And so the alliance, the Sinister alliance, I believe they have control of the financial intelligence network through the three fund cartel, State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock. They have the human intelligence network controlled by entrapment, extortion, and blackmail through an international pedophile ring of the type run by Justin Trudeau's roommate, Christopher Charles Ingveldson. Through Childbase, they can track any abused victim through face images, any hotel that the abused victim might have gone to, any suspect, and any witness. They basically can put a parallel narrative together which predicates that the individual that might look like you or me on a visit to Taipei, but is in fact an actor, takes a child into a room and abuses the child, and then there's a footage, but it's a parallel narrative that can then be used to extort cooperation from a target, whether that's Donald Trump or Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton, using pimps in various target areas. That it looks like Ghislaine Maxwell was the New York pimp, Christopher Charles Ingveldson was the Vancouver pimp, and Jimmy Savile in London for 50 or 60 years was the BBC's pimp. That's a very powerful network. Over to you, Jason.
David, there's some construction right outside my window right now, so people are going to hear drilling and things. Can you hear that?
Yep.
So we've got that. You know, David, there's a lot of people calling for, or basically identifying exactly what you have, just the outsized control that these corporations have.
And I think actually those funds, they are liable for what has been done by the corporations they control. Now let's take Raytheon, for example. Raytheon is controlled by this trio, the three fund cartel. Do you remember what Raytheon got recognition for in the patent office? The 10 millionth patent?
Yeah.
Maybe we could just get the image of what that looked like, because I think this underlines the idea of the unmarked grave to destroy evidence of a crime scene. Yeah, look at that. So that is an image. And each of these stories is basically food for a documentary in and of itself. But this is a picture through radar, three-dimensional radar, for which Raytheon had a patent. LiDAR, sorry, had a patent. But this is effectively what you're looking at is the unmarked graves for body bits of hundreds, thousands of Americans who died in 9/11. Now, the team that went in then sorted out the human remains, but they got the bigger bits. Now, what I believe would have happened is they bleached any indication of what might have brought those towers down from the biological bits, and they sent a bag of body bits to the families if there was enough to identify it with, and the families would probably have cremated the individual. But you can see David, from the nature. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're about to talk about it. The most compelling aspect of this image that I'm concerned most people still haven't been able to appreciate after looking at it so many times, because it took me literally years of looking at this to recognize the difference. But we've got this pile of, lumpy, clumpy, essentially melted rubble that is World Trade 1 and 2, right?
Right.
Then we've got this right here, which is not melted and lumpy, but rather a giant hole in the middle of a rather jagged, exploded-looking thing. And then we've got this also melted, lumpy, clumpy thing over here, which is highly suggestive that this building And these two buildings were destroyed by the same mechanism, and this used a completely different one.
Yes, there was a bomb, and that's building number 6, the customs building. And down in the basement, down below, there was stores of gold, right? So this was a gold heist, right? And then building number 7, on floors 21, they had a joint office, I think, of the IRS, the CIA, and the US Department of Defense. And that, I believe, was the command center for the demolition of Towers 1 and 2. And that was the one, again, back to the BBC, is controlling the parallel narrative. 15 minutes before that building came down, Jane Stanley in New York announced that they were getting news building number 7 had collapsed. It was still standing.
David, we've got a debate in our comments right here.
Sorry?
Well, we've got a debate in our comments. Some people feel that the difference in destruction is because directed energy weapons were used. Other people feel it's because nuclear weapons were used. What do you think?
Neither.
Why would... I think we've got thermite in these that resulted in the melting, and could be conventional explosives here, no?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so, again, the introduction of directed energy, a very good way of testing those kind of theories is to see if the patent office has got a significant number of patents related to demolition through directed energy. As far as I remember, there are none. There are a number related to thermite, you see. But perhaps I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just want to say that image is a token of the 10 millionth patent granted to US patent granted to Raytheon. And that's a demonstration of what Raytheon could have been involved in on 911, which is running satellite surveillance or remote sensing technology over the crime scene in order to control the outcome, not just the outcome of the crime itself, the outcome of the crime scene investigation. And that's what this Sinister alliance is capable of doing, is taking any crime, 7/7 underground bombing, the attack in Mumbai on Thanksgiving Day, the incident in Christchurch where the man wearing a helmet, right? But you pointed out there's no blood, etc., etc. These look to me very much like, particularly if you go to the BBC's story about it, like a parallel narrative, where the BBC has the ability to deliver in real time one narrative for public consumption and the other narrative to signal to the various parties that need to be at the crime scene before the crime actually happens to bear false witness and say, I saw a plane, I didn't see a plane, etc., etc. So we get whipsawed, and the two companies that are capable of doing that, and this is very important, are Maximus and Serco. Serco is one of the partners to that child-based operation. So it can track people through face recognition, through a hotel, and create a parallel narrative that incriminates them or makes it look like they have been abusing a child in a hotel room. It turns out subsequently with Operation OR, associated with that child-based operation, that in a particular case, some of the accusations were being made against people whose credit cards had been stolen. And 33
before we get off of this
suicide.
Raytheon patent, David, you must recall that during the first ever David Hawkins Christmas Spectacular, our special guest, then U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, he didn't want to talk about Serco. He wanted to talk about space. Right.
So just going back down that timeline or narrative as it relates to Serco. Serco was RCAGB 1929, right? It played a major role in putting the wireless transmitter technology together for Operation Bodyguard and so on, so that when the Germans shut off their transmissions to prevent their beacons being used as homing beacons, the British would switch in their RCA transmitters, which had got, I believe, up to a megawatt of medium wave power for the BBC, with perfect German speakers, agents, who then injected into the German public the idea that the Gestapo were moving out the elite German high command in order to avoid being bombed by allies. So they undermined the confidence of the German people in their command. The German command was being listened to and tapped by the Enigma machine. So the British had a complete control of all of the German agents inside the United Kingdom during World War II. Fast forward, after the Mengele experiments were over and he was a hunted man, I believe particularly the Fabian Socialists were troubled by how could they maintain development of a eugenics population control program. So I think when Pierre Trudeau came back from his trip to, I think he was in China in 1949 to celebrate the Maoist revolution, he came back to Canada after he'd been studying at Harvard Business School, not at Harvard and Sorbonne and the London School of Economics. He came back a committed Fabian. And Fabians believe in population control through eugenics, centralized credit, right, and government by elite bureaucrats, which is the situation I believe the Five Eyes countries five today. But I believe they have an active program of biowarfare development tested on captive populations, whether it's a residential school or a prison. Essentially, what I think is being offered to either the school, the children, or the prisoners is you've got an option. We can put you in a cell with a not very nice cellmate who might rape you, or you can take a vaccine and we'll let you out and you can now become an asymptomatic carrier of a pathogen under gain of function research funded by the Three Fund Cartel.
There's certain things that you say, David, that hook my attention, and I go off looking for things. And then when you say over to you, I have a tendency to bring us back to those things that might redirect from something else that you were talking about. But this Nazi doctor experimentation, it's very obvious just from looking at the undisputed history that elements of the US government, the Canadian government, the British government, they so valued the scientific nature of this information that they set aside any ethical concerns. Here's an article from the New York Times talking about Joseph Mengele. I think I've mentioned to you that I saw this National Geographic documentary which spoke about this town, Candido Godoy in Brazil, where they have a remarkably high concentration of twins, like something like 1,400% higher occurrence of twins in this obscure Brazilian town than anywhere else. It's not disputed that Joseph Mengele escaped to and died in Brazil. This claims he died in 1979, and he was notorious for his medical experiments. This article tells us that, some scientist has found some other reason why this town has such a bizarre high occurrence of twins, despite the fact that, many Brazilian individuals in this town who are pretty isolated from, television and all that sort of stuff in the 60s, identified Mengele by pictures and said, oh yeah, that's the OBGYN. Now look at this. While studying the baptism certificates, the scientists that this New York Times article focuses on confirmed that the highest concentration of twins had been in Sao Pedro with 33 pairs, David, out of 436 births from 1959 to 2008, all living in 1.5 square miles. I don't know. I just found this article right now. I watched the whole entire National Geographic documentary, and it was pretty compelling, presented a lot of good evidence that these women had seen and had been treated by Dr. Mengele. We're out of time here on YouTube, David, and we're about to make our transition over to Patreon and Subscribestar, where people will be able to watch us on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi, and subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I should actually say it's not just a matter of being out of time on YouTube. We're out of time, David, with our free preview that people can also watch on rumble.com/user/CS The Truth. They can also watch on the David Hawkins Reverse CSI YouTube channel, and hope that people will become subscribers to that channel. Totally free, and you can get our simulcasts each week. David, I'll see you in less than 5 minutes when we continue with our sponsor exclusive segment coming up next.
Thank you, Jason.